The cold wind of the northern timberlands cut through the small town of Ash Hollow as if it meant to scrape away the sins that gathered there. It was auction day, not for cattle, not for tools, but for souls. A circle of rough-faced men stood around the wooden platform in the muddy square, spitting tobacco and shouting bids as if buying a person was just another trade. The sheriff called it indenture, but everyone knew better. It was a sale of desperation. And that's where he stood, a tall, silent man with shoulders as broad as a barn beam and hands scarred by years of chopping cedar and pine. His name was Eli Turner, a lumberjack who lived deep in the forest, alone since the day the war took his brothers and left him with silence as his only companion. He didn't speak much, didn't drink much, didn't dream much. He just worked, and when he wasn't working, he listened to the wind whisper through the pines like ghosts of the past. Then came the moment that froze even the cruelest laughter. They brought her out, a woman with a burlap sack over her head, her hands bound, her dress torn and dirty. No one knew her story, but whispers passed like wildfire. Some said she was a thief's widow. Others said she had been found wandering near the river, refusing to speak. The sheriff banged the gavel. "We start the bidding at $2. The crowd erupted in mockery. "Ain't worth a dime," someone shouted. "I'll pay 50 cents just to toss her back in the river." Another sneered. Laughter echoed harsh and hollow. Eli watched, his jaw tightening. He didn't know why, but something in the way she stood, quiet, trembling but proud, pulled at the place in his heart he thought had died long ago. The bidding stalled. Nobody wanted her. $2, Eli said suddenly, his deep voice slicing through the air like an axe. The crowd went quiet for a beat, then erupted again in laughter. $2 for the sackhead. Guess the lumberjack's lonely. Someone jeered. Eli ignored them, tossed the coins into the sheriff's hand, and stepped forward. "She's mine now," he said simply. The sheriff handed over the rope tied to her wrists, muttering about how he'd just saved the county 2 more mouths to feed. Eli didn't look at the jeering crowd again. He led her away through the dirt street, past the saloon and the church, out into the wild that swallowed all judgment. The woman stumbled behind him, silent, until they reached his cabin deep in the woods, a sturdy place built by his own hands, smelling of pine resin and wood smoke. He untied her hands then, without a word, reached up and gently removed the sack from her head. For a long second, neither spoke. Her face was streaked with dirt and fear, but her eyes, those eyes, were something else entirely. Blue like a mountain lake, but filled with storms. "You can stay," Eli said gruffly. "Ain't no one coming out here to bother you." She didn't answer, just nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as though afraid the world might break her again. That night, Eli chopped wood long after sunset, his mind restless. He didn't know who she was or what had brought her to that cruel stage, but he knew she didn't belong there. She ate little, spoke nothing, but every time he looked away, he caught something unspoken in her gaze, a story too painful for words. Days passed, turning into weeks. She began to sweep the cabin, tend the fire, even hum softly when she thought he wasn't listening. Once he caught her staring out the window at the snowflakes drifting down, tears tracing her cheeks. "You don't owe me nothing," Eli said quietly. "You're free here." She shook her head, whispering the first words he'd ever heard her say. "Freedom doesn't come that easy." The sound of her voice stirred something deep inside him. He wanted to ask her name, but she looked so fragile. He was afraid the question itself might break her. He simply nodded and went back to splitting logs, but that night he couldn't sleep. He listened to the crackle of the fire and wondered who she really was and why. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel so empty anymore. The snow kept falling. One morning Eli woke to find her gone. Panic clawed at his chest. He followed her tracks through the woods until he found her by the riverbank, staring at the frozen water. "You don't have to run," he said softly, stepping closer. "I ain't your captor." She turned, eyes glistening. "Then what am I to you?" she asked. He didn't have an answer, only silence and the sound of the wind. But as he looked at her, something inside him whispered. A truth he hadn't dared speak aloud. She was the first person who'd made him feel alive. In a very long time, spring came late that year. The snow melted slow, revealing muddy trails and patches of green peeking through the earth. Life in the forest returned, the creak of trees, the chatter of birds, the rhythmic echo of Eli's axe as it bit into oak and cedar. The woman, still quiet most days, began to smile more often. She'd cook by the fire, hum songs from a past she wouldn't speak of, and sometimes stand on the porch watching him work. The loneliness that had haunted his heart began to fade, replaced by something gentler, warmer. But she still hadn't told him her name, and he still hadn't asked again. He figured when she was ready, she'd tell him. Until then, silence spoke enough. One evening, a storm rolled in, violent and cold, shaking the cabin to its bones. Lightning flashed through the forest and thunder cracked like cannon fire. Eli found her kneeling by the window, trembling. "It's just a storm," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "You're safe here." But her eyes were distant, trapped somewhere else. "They used to lock me in the cellar during storms," she whispered, voice breaking. "Said I brought bad luck, said I was cursed." Eli's fists clenched in anger. "You ain't cursed," he said fiercely. "You're just hurt." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she reached for him. Her fingers brushed his, hesitant but desperate for warmth. That night they sat by the fire until the storm passed, and when the dawn came, she finally spoke again. "My name," she said quietly, "is Clara." Eli froze, the sound of it like music after years of silence. "Clara," he repeated softly, as if saying it might make it real. She nodded, tears glistening. "That's the first time I've said it since they sold me," she whispered. Eli stood, heart pounding. "You ain't a thing to be sold," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "You're a woman with a name, and I'd be a fool not to see that." He turned toward the small wooden table by the fire, pulled open a drawer, and took out a simple silver ring, one he'd carved himself years ago, back when he thought he'd never have anyone to give it to. He dropped to one knee, eyes steady. "Clara, I don't got much. Just this land, this cabin, and a heart that's yours if you'll have it. You don't owe me nothing, but I'd be proud to call you my wife." She gasped, hands trembling. "You'd marry me?" she whispered. "After where I came from?" He smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "A name like yours deserves to be spoken every day, and I aim to do just that." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, whispering yes. The forest outside seemed to exhale as the storm clouds broke and sunlight spilled through the trees. That day they became man and wife, not in a church or under the eyes of the town, but beneath the whispering pines, where only God and the wind bore witness. He placed the ring on her finger, and she placed her heart in his hands. For the first time the cabin was filled not with silence, but laughter, hope, and the sound of two souls healing together. Years later, folks in Ash Hollow would tell the story of the lumberjack, who paid $2 for a woman with a sack on her head and married her when she said her name. But those who really knew them said the truth was simpler. Eli Turner didn't buy a woman. He rescued a name, a soul, and a love that was worth far more than any coin ever minted.